Sisters and brothers, a year ago we blew away the Haymarket Pig statue at the start of the youth riot in Chicago. The head of the Police Sergeants Association called emotionally for all-out war between the pigs and us. We accepted. Last night we destroyed the pig again. This time it begins a fall offensive of youth resistance that will spread from Santa Barbara to Boston, back to Kent and Kansas. Now we are everywhere, and next week families and tribes will attack the enemy around the country. We are not just attacking targets, we are bringing a pitiful, helpless giant to its knees.
It is commonplace for historians like me to imagine a good 1960s, one marked by the triumphs of the Civil Rights Movement, the 1967 Summer of Love, the emergence of women's, queer, and black liberation movements, and the 1969 Woodstock Summer Music Festival. In this paradigm, after Woodstock, comes the bad 1960s, a period marked by social, political, and state violence, and things just coming apart. But a close look at Weatherman, a faction of SDS that pledged itself to militant violence in support of the black freedom struggle in the United States, confounds that narrative. Activists like Bernardine Dohrn, a law student at the University of Chicago, and Bill Ayers, an early childhood teacher and undergraduate at the University of Michigan, entered the struggle because of the appeal of the good 1960s, only to find that the ideals of the nonviolent civil rights and anti-war movements could not be realized in the face of a United States government opposed to change. Initially in support of the Black Panthers, Weatherman began to organize violent clashes with the police and blow things up, a period that was punctuated by 5 activists setting off a device by mistake in a townhouse on 11th Street in Greenwich Village, New York. 3 were killed and 2 escaped. Weatherman then disappeared, became the Weather Underground, vowed not to take lives again, and declared war on the United States government. Over a decade later, these activists began to surface. Some were arrested, some rejoined society, some were killed, and many of them had children whose early years were spent moving between safe houses, remembering new names, and keeping an eye out for the police. Now the Weather Kids and the Panther Cubs are starting to tell their stories. One of them is Zayd Ayers Dohrn, one of 3 brothers raised by Bernardine Dohrn and Bill Ayers. He dropped into Political Junkie to talk about his new book, Dangerous, Dirty, Violent, and Young, A Fugitive Family in the Revolutionary Underground. Zayd Ayers Dohrn, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So your new book, Dangerous, Dirty, Violent, and Young, which tells a personal history of what was first called Weatherman and then became the Weather Underground, really came out of a wonderful podcast you did, which is where we first met, called Mother Country Radicals. Can you just talk to our listeners a little bit about what inspired you to do this research on your family and on the political events that they were enmeshed in?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, it's a personal story for me. I mean, I grew up underground when my parents were fugitives. I've thought about the story a lot. I've talked to my parents about it a lot. But I never wrote about it. In fact, I've been a professional writer for 20 years and never really touched my parents' story. I think what inspired that first version, the podcast, was during the pandemic, really. I was thinking, a lot of my other projects, my theater and film projects, were stalled, and I was looking for something to do. And meanwhile, separated from my parents, and they were getting older, and I was just kind of wanting to have conversations that I felt like, that you remember what that was like during the pandemic. It felt like maybe a last chance to talk to people who I'm separated from. So I started recording our phone calls first, and then in-person conversations. We were in our own little COVID bubble. And at the same time, of course, during the pandemic, we had George Floyd's murder, and Ferguson was a couple of years before that. And you had this it was the first Trump administration. you had this sort of cascading sense in the world that we were facing authoritarianism, racism, Christian nationalism in a way that maybe hadn't been seen since the 60s and 70s. And I just found myself suddenly very eager to think about how do people resist that kind of fascist takeover? How have people tried to challenge an out of control law enforcement apparatus and a Justice Department gone rogue and all those kinds of things? So yeah, those conversations became the podcast, which then through a very weird series of events, I sort of realized I hadn't told the full story, and that became the book.
Yeah. So your parents, Bernadine Dohrn and Bill Ayers, were involved in social movements. They kind of gradually got involved in social activism. Bernadine when she was at the University of Chicago, Bill when he was at the University of Michigan. It's a very long time before they become a couple or your parents. So you have to kind of track them separately, causes each of them. And I think your book suggests it's a really different impulse on both of their parts. What causes each of them to become more and more radicalized? Because lots of people didn't. Lots of people marched and then they went home, or they, went into the Peace Corps or something like that. But your parents decided to fight separately. So what moves them to do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, a big part of the book is devoted to trying to understand exactly that. As you said, I think when we think about the 60s now, there's this mythology that all college students were radical and that resisting the war and resisting racism was sort of the default mode. But of course, it wasn't. And especially in the early days of the 60s, it was very unpopular, uncommon, especially for white people to, be out there protesting against police racism, for example. As you said, my parents took different trajectories. For my mother, she was a law student at the University of Chicago when Dr. King showed up in Chicago to lead the rent strike against housing discrimination and exploitation by racist slumlords. And my mom volunteered as a sort of legal observer and started working for the civil rights movement. A couple of years later, Dr. King was killed, of course, and that really sent her on a different trajectory of kind of away from the politics of nonviolence and into a more radical confrontational stance. She became the leader of a group called SDS, Students for Democratic Society. And through that group, she became involved with Fred Hampton and the Chicago Black Panthers. And they were part of this, what Fred called the Rainbow Coalition of activist groups. And they were fighting for, more kind of just society through more confrontational, street protests and so on. And then Fred Hampton was murdered. So I think my mom's radicalization really took the form of following Black mentors in the Black freedom movement and then watching them killed by racist vigilantes and by the state. And that really radicalized her. My father was at the University of Michigan and he became an anti-war activist, like a lot of young men radicalized, against the draft. And that sort of anti-war stance brought him to Chicago, made him join SDS, and then he followed my mother when she broke SDS and formed the Weatherman. And so eventually, they became allies and comrades and eventually a couple. But as you say, it was really two separate trajectories that eventually merged in our family.
Yeah, and thinking about that meeting of SDS where the organization just splinters. I mean, a lot of things happen at that meeting. Your mother's group, the Action Faction, I believe they called themselves, was super militant. And really, Bernadine stages a walkout and says, anybody who really wants to change something, you need to follow me. Let's go. And so there's that. There are a lot of the older SDS leadership, like Tom Hayden, who are just having a meltdown. There's another piece of that meeting. I believe that Chicago Women's Liberation also comes out of that meeting. There's a whole group of women. Joe Freeman is one of them. I think Shuli Firestone is another, who say we can't function in this male-dominated organization. We're going to go do something else. So that moment is really just sort of a pivot point for the movement, but it's relatively few people. How did Bernadine in particular imagine that a very small group of people, a revolutionary vanguard, was going to be able to pull the masses with her?
Wow, well, it's a great question. I think a couple of things are happening. As you said, it's a complicated moment and a very dramatic scene. And I tell the story in my book of that meeting and why it was such a pivotal moment. It came a year after the 68 protests in Chicago at the DNC. It came as a lot of student activists were really struggling for, what is the way forward? How can we continue to organize when Black leaders are being killed, when the war seems to be accelerating, no matter what we do? And as you said, there was kind of, this will be familiar to anybody who's following leftist movements today, there were a lot of complicated fault lines and intersections around issues of identity, gender, race, and so on. One of those issues was that my mother's group, the Action Faction or the Revolutionary Youth Movement, were very committed to following what they saw as the leadership of the Black Vanguard, the Black Panther Party in particular. And I think you have to remember in context, they were looking around at the world and seeing small groups of people, revolutionary vanguards, changing the world in various ways, in Cuba, right, and in Algeria. And they were thinking about what would it look like in America to be a part of a small group of committed activists who were working to create radical change. I think they saw that kind of radical change coming primarily from the Black Freedom Movement. They saw the Black Panther Party as the vanguard of that potential revolution. And my mom decided the main thing that white activists had to do was follow the leadership of the Black Vanguard. And that was complicated. And it meant giving up on certain other alliances. It meant fracturing the movement in certain ways. And I think a lot of people still look back at that moment as a pivotal turning point for good and ill around, because STS, you're right, it was a small group of people at the convention, several hundred people, maybe 1,000. But STS was that was the kind of leadership of what was the largest student activist group in the country at the time. So yeah, it was a small group making decisions for a large number of people.
And the idea that Black Americans are a kind of radical vanguard is not a new one, right? I mean, the Communist Party of the United States in the 1920s and 30s had emerged with that view that thinking about Black Americans as an indigenous proletariat was really the way to go. And there was a lot of very serious thinking, some of which may have been wrong-headed, some of which was not. It attracted people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Richard Wright and so on. So there was a lot of serious thinking that said, because Black people have suffered and fought for centuries, they know things that we don't. We need to take direction. This is how we get rid of racism, right?
Correct. Yeah, and it goes even back further than that, as you said, W.B. Du Bois, but also Frederick Douglass and John Brown talking about how armed slave rebellion was the way to transform racial relationships in this country. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So part of what is unusual about this moment, and I'm glad that you brought up all these other revolutions. I mean, really, when at that SDS meeting, when Weatherman is formed, it's really only 20 years after the Chinese Revolution. And
Correct.
so
it was a revolutionary century. A lot was happening. Yeah.
Exactly. And, the works of Mao were incredibly important, both to the Panthers and to people like your parents. The works of who was the dictator of North Korea at that point, Kim Il-sung, right? Okay. And I mean, his work was incredibly important to a lot of the Panthers that I knew. But what is it that allows a woman to rise up in a very, very male, very aggressively male movement and kind of take charge and take people with her? What was there about the Weatherman that made that possible?
I mean, that's the whole first half of my book is really a lot about that. What made the cultural context, what in the cultural context made that possible? And also what about my mother, about Bernadine, was so specific and unusual that could be possible. I mean, she was, at the time she became the leader of SDS or one of the co-leaders of SDS, she was probably the most prominent, at least one of the most prominent women leaders of the New Left. And it wasn't a very common position for women. Right. I mean, as in most parts of society, the movement was deeply sexist and a lot of casual misogyny. And it was very hard for women to assume leadership roles. Of course, it wasn't unprecedented. I mean, she was, Angela Davis or later Assata Shakur. There were people in the movement who commanded that kind of following and allegiance. But I think, just to stick with my mom for a second, there were some things that made her very unusual. One was, she has a kind of fierce revolutionary commitment that I grew up with. And I spent a lot of time in the book talking about what it's like to have that as your mother. But it meant that she was really suited for her moment. She sort of matched the zeitgeist of a movement that was moving in a more radical direction. So that's part of it. I think, there was also huge symbolic value on both sides. I think men in the movement and men in the government saw this, pretty white woman leading in this and saying all these radical revolutionary things, and it made her an object of fascination and a curiosity. And that symbolic value had a lot of importance. Later when she was put on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, replacing Angela Davis on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, J. Edgar Hoover called her the most dangerous woman in America. And I think a lot of that was this symbolic value of a middle-class white girl deciding to throw her lot in with the Black Panthers. That scared a lot of people, and it made her an important figure quite apart from her actual leadership of the movement.
Yeah. Of course, J. Edgar Hoover, just to sit with him for a second, because I wrote a whole book about him and the war on crime in the 1930s.
Yeah.
He had a tendency to vilify women, whether they were important or not. So, like, one of the women he vilifies is Ma Barker, whose sons and various friends were the Barker Carpets gang. In fact, Ma Barker probably wasn't a criminal. They probably schlepped her around from place to place, and she cooked and did the laundry and so on. There was Ethel Rosenberg, who everybody inside that investigation knew had really done nothing, was not a spy, but she became vilified as this super dangerous, villainous woman and so on. So there's a piece of that going on with your mother. But one of the things you talk about a little bit that really gave me pause was the level to which, aside from who she was, brilliant, articulate, fantastic manager, your mother was sexualized. And she was sexualized inside the movement and outside the movement. And that really gave me a lot of pause, because I'm kind of like guilty as charged. I remember being a kid and seeing the wanted posters in the post office and thinking, my God, if I could only be that, if I could only be her. So is there something that, I mean, I was thinking I kind of got stuck on the sexualization. In fact, she represents something women aren't allowed to be in 19.
Correct. Yes, I think that's astute. I think, first of all, well, I quote Todd Getlin in the book talking about how she fused the two premium sort of female archetypes of the moment, sex goddess and street fighter, right? And of course, you're right that women in the movement and elsewhere in our culture, there's always this element of like sexualization, and always, as you talk about with J. Edgar Hoover, a kind of intrinsic challenge to patriarchy and authority. You think about the way Trump handles women who defy him in any way, and how it provokes this sort of clearly visceral disgust in him when a woman stands up to him, whether it's a reporter or a congresswoman, right? And I think there was some of that with my mom. I mean, she had a kind of a defiance, and coming from a young woman, these men who were used to be treated with a certain deference, it enraged them. That was true in the FBI, true in the government, and true in the movement. I mean, I think she made enemies of men who felt like she didn't know her place. But I also think, and I quote some of these women in the book, that there were a lot of women in the movement like you who were looking at her and saying, like, right on, like, let's move in a direction of assertiveness and confidence and articulacy that women should have every right to embody.
You know, she was very also what I would call rock and roll. I mean, when I think of your mother, I think of Grace Slick. I think of Janis Joplin. I think of these women who lived the way they weren't supposed to live, sang in voices they weren't supposed to sing in. And your dad, let's not forget him, because he has a tendency to sort of end up in the slipstream, but he's done a lot of his own writing about the movement. He's an incredibly thoughtful person. He was incredibly committed revolutionary. How does he decide to radicalize, become a revolutionary, and then ultimately throw his lot in with your mom?
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. It's funny you say caught in the slipstream. I think even his self-presentation has a lot of sort of Zelig, like, he was in the right place at the right time and sort of gets pulled along by some of these larger currents in the culture. My mom does too, of course, but she has a more assertive, like, agency about, I'm going to seize this moment. I think for my father, like anybody who becomes radicalized, it was a multi-step process. He was a student activist at the University of Michigan against the war and kind of against racism in a casual way. I think his first protest he ever went to was outside a pizza place in Ann Arbor that wouldn't serve Black students. And so, that was just happening on campuses, much the way student activism is happening on campuses now. And if you were a student with a certain cast of mind, a certain kind of idealism, you might wind up at some of these protests. He was arrested for the first time at a sit-in, SDS sit-in at the Selective Service Center in Ann Arbor, protesting the draft. So, you see these steps of like first protest, first arrest, and then eventually he winds up kind of in SDS, traveling to Chicago, being part of the DNC protests, getting beat up by the police and arrested at those protests. And each step of the way, he and his friends, especially Diana Oughton and Terry Robbins, who were two of his close friends at the time, are saying to themselves, like, you have to do more. There's a genocide happening in Vietnam in our names. And I think they really, both for good reasons and bad reasons, jacked each other up to say, like, we can never do enough to oppose the terror that is happening overseas, that is being perpetrated by our government.
Right.
And that kind of sense of we can never do enough leads to radicalization, again, for good and eventually for ill.
They train themselves in ways that, to the contemporary mind, you realize are designed to, this is the wrong way to put it, to kind of make people crazy. I mean, the sleep deprivation, the struggle sessions in which you would be surrounded by your friends telling you everything that was wrong with you and every way that you had failed ever. That there's a certain amount of trauma built into the history of the time. And I just want to emphasize, listeners, we've grown so used to state violence, and we've grown so used to police violence. We've grown so used to having a violent president. I cannot overemphasize how shocking the violence of the 1960s was, and how unprecedented it seemed. And of course it wasn't, because World War II was incredibly violent, the firebombing of entire cities and so on. But enough time had passed, and certainly for young people, nobody had seen that on television. You saw the Vietnam War on television. You saw the protests at the DNC on television. We saw reporters being beaten up on television. So it was a profoundly shocking moment that when the townhouse in Greenwich Village blows up because a group of weathermen are in the townhouse, they're building a bomb. Terry Robbins misses a connection or makes a connection he shouldn't make. The whole building goes up. That was sort of shocking, but all of a sudden it was sort of like, yeah, this is how things are. So do you think, I'm sorry to go on and on because it's your book, but did they have any sense of like, yes, we need to escalate because others are escalating? Or do you think they kind of lost perspective on what violence even meant anymore?
I think both. I mean, I think yes and on that. They did decide in a very conscious way and in a rhetorical way and in a literal way that escalation was necessary. You know, many of their slogans, I talk about this in the book, that their slogans like "Bring the war home," or they were, or "I am Marian Delgado," which referred to sort of like knocking trains off their tracks. They had all these kind of ideas of we cannot be passive when these terrible things are happening. And so escalation became the order of the day. And once you start comparing yourself to the US military in a sort of an aspirational sense, when you start saying they're dropping bombs in Vietnam, we've got to drop bombs here in America. If they're killing people over there, we got to kill people over here. It can get very dangerous very quickly. And I do think in that sense, those early Weatherman actions and the kind of 1969, 1970 escalation before they went underground was a very dangerous moment for them and for the movement, because it was a way of trying to disassociate themselves from their human impulse of decency and empathy and peacefulness, and trying to say we have to get more hardcore, we have to get more violent. And as you say, that led to the tragedy at the townhouse. And luckily, in the wake of that, my mom and Jeff Jones and some other people pulled the Weathermen back from that kind of deadly approach to violence.
Yeah, and yet they also keep blowing things up. And
they
I
keep
think
blowing things up. Deadly violence, not violence. Yeah.
Right, not violence, which is actually kind of astonishing. We were talking about the internet before we started to record. It's actually kind of astonishing that they knew how to do all of these things, and they got really good at it. They got really good at how to not be followed, all kinds of surveillance techniques and so on. But it also kind of highlights that in some ways it's their actions that reframed the world. I mean, the idea that you could simply, as a white woman dressed as a secretary, walk into the Pentagon and wander around and try to figure out, like, where's the best place to leave a bomb is astonishing. You could never do that now, right?
I don't know. I don't know. I
Yeah.
think, I mean, yeah, you're right that there was a very unique moment, and it is astonishing. These are a bunch of college kids and college dropouts and law students who, you say that they got very good at it, which is true, but they got very good at it over 12 years of living underground. And when they started, they were not at all good at it. And they
Right.
really they didn't know how to be outlaws. They didn't know how to build bombs. And they really taught themselves these things. They literally learned to build dynamite bombs by reading a textbook and figuring it out themselves. It's all very DIY. And a lot of their sort of underground techniques they made up. How do you avoid a tail? How do you rent a safe house? How do you make new ID? They figured all that out because they were a bunch of smart kids who needed to figure out how to avoid being caught by the FBI. Nevertheless, it is astonishing that for 12 years they evaded a nationwide FBI dragnet. Like, you think about today, I don't know, Luigi Mangione or somebody, and you think like just staying hidden for 7 days with your face on the front page of every newspaper is quite a feat.
Right.
And my mom did that for years and years. Could it happen today? It's tricky. There are, I talk about in the book about how there are undergrounds today. There are undergrounds of undocumented people. There are abortion undergrounds. There are criminal undergrounds. There are right-wing undergrounds. There are people who are, on the run from the law in all sorts of ways. Tricky once you become public enemy number one and the media is entirely focused on your face. Staying underground can be very hard, but they did manage that for quite a long time.
Yes, and they changed the way they looked, they changed the way they dressed. There were a range of things they did. I do want to say, again, thinking about my own research on the FBI was never very good at capturing fugitives.
Yes.
You
I
know,
think that's right. I think
invariably,
this punctured their myth in a lot of ways.
yeah, what I mean, they didn't actually get John Dillinger. Somebody turned him in. So they were very often reliant on networks of informants. And part of what was very unique in some ways about Weatherman is that their ideological commitment to each other. But I want to pivot right now and talk about that moment when your parents, having decided to become a couple, decide that they want you. And they're underground and they are living this very fragile life. I mean, when you think about how people prepare to have babies, it's just boggling. And they read a book about how to give birth, and some of their comrades are around to help
Yeah.
them. Uh,
Yeah.
so they invite you in, and it's tough. You're very restrained about it in the book and very loving toward your parents, but you've obviously been chewing on it for a while. What did it mean for these people living this life to bring you and Malik into their world, for Kathy to bring Chesa into her world, for Chesa to then end up with your dad because your mom's in jail because she won't testify before the grand jury? I mean, it's the kind of thing that you think about all these bourgeois people in the suburbs, and they're worried about, like, will I make summer camp sign up? So can you talk a little bit about how you decided to dig a little deeper into what this meant between all of you, the five of you
Yeah.
together?
Yeah. Well, I have been chewing on it for a long time, as you say. And I think if the first half of my book is about what radicalized my parents, and in particular my mother, the second half of the book is about my childhood and how did I grow up and what did that mean to grow up the child of revolutionaries?
Right.
And it's really it's a coming of age book in multiple generations. And it's about, how you make sense of the world you're given and how you try to kind of pass that forward in some way. Yeah, the reason I've been chewing on it for a long time is because when I was growing up underground, it all seemed very normal. I think probably most people can relate to the fact that, like, it takes a while, it takes into your adolescence to look at your parents and be like, they're pretty weird. Like, there's something
Right.
weird going on. When you're a kid, it's all you know. And especially in my situation, which was a real hothouse of revolutionary underground, everybody we knew was on the run from the police. My friends were the children of Weathermen and Black Panthers and Black Liberation Army members and young lords. So it didn't seem that unusual that we were on the run. I knew that the FBI was chasing us. I knew that my mom was a fugitive, that they were both fugitives. I knew that they had broken the law. But, they explained it in terms of like movie outlaws. I mean, they talked about Star Wars and the Rebel Alliance and Robin Hood and Little John and his merry men. And it was like, all right, there are good outlaws out there. It made sense. And but then, of course, when I was 4, we turned ourselves in to the police. When I was 6, my mom went to prison for a year. And I did start to think a little bit even then about like, well, what does all this mean? I mean, that the painful separation, the abandonment by my mom when she went to prison. And then we adopted my brother Chesa, and his parents had been involved in a bank robbery in which several people were killed, and they went to prison for decades. We
Right.
adopted Chesa. So I spent a lot of time as I grew up thinking about what were our parents doing, and what kind of sacrifices did they make, and how close did my own parents come to having, to what happened to Chase's parents, to really like being arrested or killed and leaving their family behind. So yeah, the
Right.
second half of the book comes out of a lot of these questions of like, how close did we come? And I discovered some things writing the book about things my parents had been involved in when I was a kid and how dangerous those things had been. And that question of how do you balance your revolutionary commitments to your commitments to your family?
Yeah. And for them, it may not have seemed like such a contradiction. I mean, they don't really say this when they're talking to you, but building the world they want to see is a commitment to your children on a certain level.
Absolutely.
And it's the kind
Absolutely.
of commitment that a child is not able to see. I have to tell you, I think one of the most poignant parts of the book, which you may have almost forgotten about, is the part where you're like begging them for a GI Joe and they don't want to get you a GI Joe. And then finally someone goes out and, they go through every toy store till they find a Native American and a black GI Joe. I, you know, I thought that was so loving because they didn't want you to have a GI Joe at all.
No, they were
And
not for
yet,
it.
these people who do not compromise actually compromised so that you could have a toy you wanted. I don't know. I thought that was incredibly sweet. Can you tell us some other things about your parents and how they ended up raising 3 such great men?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it is, of course, I'm a father now myself. So I love, when I was working on the book, I was always drawn to those stories of those complicated stories of parenthood and how you, as you said, Claire, that for them and even for me now, what feels like a contradiction, which is your outside commitments and your intimate commitments, turns out to be quite related, right? The question of like, if you're having children, especially if you have your eyes open to how terrible the world can be, you are making a decision to trust the future or to build a better future for your children. It's an optimistic, hopeful gesture. And it wasn't just my parents. It was, the Panthers and Assata Shakur was having a child in prison. And so a lot of these people, a lot of members of the radical underground had children around the same time in the late 70s and early 80s. And I think they were all partly just the biological and cultural imperative of growing up. They were in their 30s all of a sudden. And a lot of them were like, I want to have a kid. And a lot of them worried about, how can we have a kid when the FBI is chasing us or when we're locked up or whatever. And many of them made the decision, which is a very human decision and a complicated decision, like, what other life do we have? We're either going to like build a future or we're going to descend into nihilistic violence and despair. So I think that gesture of having kids, passing something along to the future, was very much a part of their revolutionary project. And yeah, I mean, in terms of their parenting, one of the contradictions in the book, which I spend some time exploring, is like they were great parents. And I always felt very safe and very loved and prioritized. When I wore them down about buying me a G.I. Joe, that was a compromise from them, as you said, who are, my mom in particular, very uncompromising people. And they bought me, yeah, the black G.I. Joe and the indigenous G.I. Joe, the only ones in the Hasbro lineup at the time. It was all white soldiers except for those two. And I never even, I mean, I watched the cartoons in a motel while we were underground, and I had a vague sense that there was a spectrum of G.I. Joe characters. But in my family, the way they presented it, I just figured I had the main two, and it was all about like seeing the world through the lens of it's not all white men, it's not all a white gays. It's not all the patriarchy. And, like when they got me a Cabbage Patch Kid, I don't tell this in the book, but when they got me a Cabbage Patch Kid, it was a black girl doll. And for a while, that was very startling for me. When you're a kid, you kind of want the doll that looks like you. But they were always kind of involved in that project of teaching us to see outside our own, cultural, class, race, gender lens. And yeah, they made a lot of compromises. And at the same time, they were teaching me how to recognize an undercover cop in a crowd and how to walk a trajectory in a city to lose a tail. And we were very much living the lives of outlaws, even though we were small kids.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things you discover when you're doing the research for the podcast, which then became the research for this book, is that your parents didn't tell you the truth about some things. And particularly, they said that once you were born, they were out. They weren't doing the fugitive, or they weren't doing the criminal actions anymore. And that wasn't true. Can you talk about that a little bit and how you have yourself perhaps compromised with them about this untruth?
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I talk about it as the origin story of my family. The way it was always presented, I think most of us have an origin story in our family that has to do with when we were born. It changed our parents in some way. It changed the family. It was a new beginning, right? And in my family, I mean, there was no hiding the fact that we were fugitives. There was no hiding the fact that we were on the run. But the way my parents always presented it was, we did these things. We were, Princess Leia and Han Solo back in the day. We broke the law. We were fighting the Empire. But then we decided to have kids, and we decided you were our main priority. And we decided that eventually we would surface and have regular lives so that you could go to school and have your own life. And I think that was an important myth for me as a kid because it centered me in the craziness of our family. It made me feel safe, and that we were being that we were the priority, the central priority of my parents' lives. What I discovered writing the book, and this was something I didn't even know while I was working on the podcast, it's something I discovered from declassified FBI files and further interviews that I did in writing the book, was that they did make that decision. They did decide, we're going to prioritize our kids. We're going to move forward without, the Weatherman organization is dead, and we will now try to build other lives. But what happened, and this is the part I didn't know, is that their comrades in the Black Underground came back to them in the early 80s saying, we need help. We're being massacred basically by the police and the FBI, and we need the help of our white allies to continue the struggle. And I think for my parents, that was an invitation that they couldn't refuse. It was a moment of saying, okay, we've made a commitment to our kids, but we have this long-standing commitment to the Black struggle, and we cannot abandon them in their time of need. So I imagine for them, I imagine, and I've talked to them about the fact that this was a deep and existential choice for them. And again, they compromised in the sense that they decided only one of them would go out at a time and they wouldn't leave us behind and both go on an action. But they did both participate in illegal, criminal, revolutionary actions when I was a little kid, leaving me behind with one or the other. And that was just a part of the story I didn't know. And it's something I don't feel betrayed by it. I just feel like as an adult now myself, I understand that those family myths can be complicated and that they are multi-layered, and that for my parents, they had these commitments that eventually came into conflict and they had to figure out what to do about that conflict.
Well, and it also changes the story. It changes the story of your own life. I mean, I've been having these conversations with my mother, who will be 93 in August. And every once in a while, she will tell me the truth about something I didn't know. And it's not that it changes who I am in some dramatic way, but you say, oh, so that's what you were doing. I would also say the part that may be so hardwired that you can't change it is if in fact you built your young political life around this kind of duty to the world, is it possible when somebody calls and says, I am Marian Delgado, to say, nope, sorry, doesn't live here anymore? Is that even possible for people?
I don't know that it's possible, and I think it's just a fact of any kind of radical commitment to the world that you might be called upon and have to make tough choices about your priorities in life.
Yeah.
But I think you're right, Claire, that like for me, the process of writing the book, it was a building on or a complicating of the family story I'd known my whole life. It didn't change my fundamental feeling of who my parents are, but it did change how I think about my childhood, how I think about being a father, how I think about my own kids. And it's kind of that lifelong process of understanding your family, which is part of understanding yourself.
Right, right. And so now we're at a moment in history where we are losing the people who had the good fortune not to die during the struggle. Kathy Boudin is gone. We miss her terribly. And you end the book with your mother's diagnosis with Alzheimer's, which I found somewhat heartbreaking. It was a surprise, and it made me so sad. Is she okay? Is there something, that steel-spined woman, is she like making it through this?
She
Like the
is
warrior
okay.
she is?
And yes, no, she is making it through it the way you'd expect from who she is. And it is heartbreaking and devastating for our family to watch. And, I end the book with it both because it's a kind of a final example of her courage and radical certainty in the face of injustice or whatever you want to call the unfairness of the things that the universe throws at all of us. It's funny because she's still very much herself. And I was with her yesterday for hours, and you can have a great conversation about Palestine and about Gaza and about Ukraine and the government. She's very with it. She's following the news. But, she's increasingly dependent on my dad in terms of day to day. How do you navigate the world? And I think, I don't know, for me in my middle age and having kids who are teenagers and growing up, and parents who are now old, both my parents are in their 80s. It's just a reminder of how, and this is what the book's about really, is the struggle is multi-generational and cyclical and evolving, and our lives are this cyclical process of kind of understanding our own childhoods so that we can pass something along to our own children, understanding our parents so that we can pass something along to the grandkids, and then letting them kind of take the lead in the next generation.
Yeah. And not letting history slip away.
Absolutely. And there are these kind of, I feel like we're living in a moment of reaction, and we have to all be serious about the fact that this is not some like, arc of history that bends constantly towards justice. I mean, maybe it does in the very long term, but in the shorter term or the medium term, you have these revolvings of the wheel, and you have moments of revolutionary struggle that then lead to moments of reaction and fascism. And we are living through a moment of profound right wing conservative reactionism. And I think how that next turn of the wheel happens is what all of us who are alive right now are faced with.
Totally agree. And then there is the kind of sediment. I mean, after I finished the book, I was thinking about the courage of organizers in Minneapolis in relation to ICE. They are, in fact, getting the John F. Kennedy Profiling Courage Award. It is being awarded to the
Yeah,
entire city of Minneapolis.
amazing. Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
one of the things I thought about is, would white people have felt that kind of commitment to people of color? Would people of color organizers have been able to mobilize white people without the moment in history that your parents and the rest of Weatherman played such an important part in?
Well, that's a deep idea and question. I mean, I agree that the courage of just ordinary people in Minneapolis was pretty astonishing. And you do see one thing I talk in many times in the book about these moments in history when people can look around and say, like, this made a difference. The end of the Vietnam War or the passing of the Voting Rights Act, and the way that like these struggles are difficult and they're met with constant setbacks. And then there are moments when you actually see viscerally and vividly, oh, this made a difference. And I think Minneapolis was that. We're still in a moment of very dangerous, anti-democratic and unconstitutional proto-fascism, but there was a moment before Minneapolis where it felt like unleashed and they were just going to sick the, ICE and the National Guard on every city in America. And those people in Minneapolis barricaded themselves in those streets, and,
Right.
and, and they won a victory. And it wasn't without costs, but it was a victory, and the government had to retreat. And I think that's inspiring.
Yeah, and that was in a way the essence of bringing the war home.
too, right? I mean, that if
Yeah.
Americans actually understood the level of violence that was being done to other people in their name, would they make it stop? And yes, I think Minneapolis was exactly that moment where people said no.
Yeah. And I think it's another example of, like, you talked about the weathermen using the fact that a white woman could walk into the Pentagon dressed as a secretary and nobody would notice or would, confront her. I think Alex Preddy and Renee Good, they weren't violent revolutionaries, and I don't think they intended to be. But what they were doing very consciously, I think, is using their white privilege, putting their bodies on the line to protect people who were in even more danger. And that kind of sacrifice is powerful, and it made a difference.
And it is an American tradition.
It is, indeed. One small part of the American tradition.
One small part of the American tradition, it's ours. Zayd, thank you so much for spending time with us today. And I just want to say to listeners, the book, Dangerous, Dirty, Violent, and Young, is going to be out on May 19th. You can pre-order it now. Pre-orders are incredibly important, as I've told you all before, to getting the press behind really promoting the book. So order it now. There'll be a link on the show notes. Zayd, thanks so much.
Appreciate it.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow us on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite podcast platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is Backseat Fuse by The Revolution. You can find their work and all the talented artists we feature on these episodes on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next week.